No veas el tío este, el señor este con cara de muñeco. Joder, no, le falta F40 en el garaje, ¿sabes?
User's guide here from DK Engineering. It's a long overdue F40. So, as many of you will know, the F40 is a particular favourite of ours. I'm often asked the question, if I
¿Por qué, archidemonio?
could only have one Ferrari, what would it be? And it's a really difficult question to answer. But if I have to give an answer, it's got to be the F40. Why? Well, for me, it's the car that strikes the balance between new and old. It's
Es lo que comenta. O sea, esto de los coches es lo que me pasa a mí. El equilibrio entre lo antiguo y lo moderno en los coches. Si pillas un coche muy antiguo, hostia, está muy bien como reliquia, pero de verdad, no, qué asco de conducir bicho ese. Si es muy moderno, joder, qué asco también. Qué cosa más rancia de coche. Me pasó con un 911. ¿De qué año era? 74. Creo que era 74. Hostia, no me acuerdo. Rodito, no entiendo nada. Redox, ¿qué dices? No sé. $611. John, ¿consideras que consumir tanto contenido basura te ha afectado tu forma de actuar o tu cabeza ya estaba muy sólida? Me tanta contenido basura no veo, ¿eh? Contenido basura es lo que acabo de poner ahora y lo he quitado, tío. El Dallas y el otro. No, no. Hombre, te puede afectar. No, pitipitudo, me refiero al equilibrio de cuando conduces, que tenga ese punto, que el coche transmite, que es divertido, que el chasis tal, ¿no? Que tiene sensaciones, un rollo tal. O es eso. ¡Oh! Eso, ¿qué te decía? Conduje un 11, ¿de qué año, tío? Creo que es 74. El primero con los fuelles en los paragolpes, el feo. Que encima uno bestial baja de potencia por la crisis del petróleo. No tenía servofreno. Era muy hierro, tío. Y frenabas y mi coche me salía disparado. No, no frenaba. Era muy hierro, tío. O sea, no tiraba. Joder, macho, era un cagarro, de verdad, ¿eh? Uf. O sea, un 356 supongo que es diferente, porque es como una especie de escarabajo, que es anterior. Pero para mí el equilibrio está partido de los 80 hacia finales de los 90. Y ahí se acaba, ¿eh? Los coches, más o menos, ¿eh? Ahora, hay de todo, ¿no? Pero por una general. Y aquí lo que dice esto, dice que, a ver qué dice.
I'm often asked the question, if I could only have one Ferrari, what would it be? And it's
El Cal dice, si tuviera un solo Ferrari, ¿cuál me quedaría?
a really difficult question to answer. But if I have to give an answer, it's got to be the
Estos coches son repintados, ¿eh? F40 solo sección rojos.
F40. Why? Well, for me, it's the car that strikes the balance between new and old. It's a new era Ferrari versus the old era Ferrari. It's Enzo Ferrari's last project that he oversaw. A little bit more about that in a minute, but here are the basics. So, in approximately 1984, the 288 GTO was launched. It used what was effectively a 308 chassis with the same V8, but this time mounted longitudinally as opposed to transverse, with a drop gear gearbox out the back.
Claro, el 288 es un hierraco con un turbolag que flipas, tío.
And unfortunately, later in the 80s.
Ah, es verdad, este era un proyecto de grupo B, que no se iba, igual que el Porsche 959, no se pudo llevar al final.
That Group B era was brought to an abrupt halt, but that didn't stop Ferrari because Enzo knew that he was onto something good. By this time, Fiat.
No lo parece, pero el F40 es una evolución del 288 y en realidad es un 288 con paragolpes y alerón. Bueno, y más redondeado, el culo, etcétera. Pero es el mismo, pero parte de la misma carrocería, ¿eh?
80s, headed up by a 13-month period in the mid to late 1980s.
Acá, por eso se hizo en solo 13 meses el coche.
The F40 was in fact developed in secret without Fiat's knowledge over just a 13.
Hostia, qué curioso. Lo hicieron en secreto sin informar a la matriz de la empresa, la Fiat. Claro, es una evolución 288. Por eso se pudo hacer en tan poco tiempo. 13 meses.
A Kevlar composite body all over. We have a front clamshell, the roof structure, the doors, the sills, the rear clam, and the rear lower valance. And that's it. Everything hanging off the chassis frame. It's a just shy of 3-litre V8, twin
Sí, es un chasis muy del monocasco muy elemental, ¿sabes?
turbo, producing approximately 480
Bueno, que es la mezcla entre chasis tubular la bañera de carbono de la carrocería, ¿no? Le han pintado las tapas de la cadena de distribución.
brake, but
Luego te contesto XZ Figu X.
again, a little bit more about that in a second. It has a gearbox hanging out the back of the engine, much like the 288 GTO. And there we have it. That makes for an incredible performance car, not only today, but for the day back in the late 1980s when it was launched. 1987 was when the public was first shown the F40. They planned to build only 400 units, but supply was soon outstripped by demand, and such was that demand that they went on to build just over 1,300 cars in total.
Sí que hace 400, pero hicieron 1.300, pues que, claro, había tantísima demanda que la reventa cuadruplicaba el precio de venta del coche. Y mira que era caro, pero se llegó a pagar $1.000.000 de la época incluso. Y eso a Ferrari le da una rabia y al final hizo 1.300 por suerte.
Including just over 200 for the USA, which were their own specification. So running through the specification of these F40s. So our early cars, I'm often asked, what is a non-cat, non-adjust car? Well, effectively, there are 4 different...
Sí, me parece lo que ha dicho ahora. Los primeros 400 o 300 unidades de F40 son los que son sin catalizar y sin el ajuste del amortiguador. El amortiguador no levanta. Los siguientes ya tienen las puertas de carbono, lleva catalizador de escape, que es una putada, y el eje delantero se levanta.
Different specifications. We have the earliest and purest form, the non-cat, non-adjust. This simply means no catalytic converter, fixed ride height suspension. Thereafter, we have from approximately very mid-1990 onwards and
A mí me molan los primeros, los siguientes, los de a partir del 90 ya son muy modernos, tío, con el catalizador y todo eso.
about
Y el interior más, poquito más lujoso.
a chassis number that starts with, well, the last 5 digits starts with an 89, the cat non-adjust. This simply means that the catalytic converter was added. And at that time, the option was also added of adjustable suspension. And that
A este coche con catalizador es, joder, macho, tío, es una cagada, ¿eh?
meant that the ride height of the car could be raised to help deal with speed bumps, because as you can see from the design and the form of the car, it's very low and speed bumps are potentially problematic. This was only available on the catalytic cars onwards, so there is no such thing as a factory-supplied non-cat adjust. However, later on people have retrofitted the adjustable suspension. Now the adjustable suspension is not for me, it's not for most owners, it is quite unreliable. It's a hydraulic system that operates based on sensors that are mounted on the...
Vale, ya decía yo, porque, vale, esto no sabía, que el sistema este de la suspensión que se levanta, que es una porquería, que es poco fiable, es hidráulico, ya me extrañaba a mí porque se ha tardado muchos años en adoptar un sistema popular para levantar el eje delantero. Me acuerdo que fabricantes de amortiguadores te cobraban una pasta por unas suspensiones con un muelle dentro que se levantaba eléctrico, una mierda. Ahora entiendo.
The front and rear anti-roll bars, and quite simply, below a certain speed, the suspension will raise up and it will stay up. And once you get above that speed, it goes down. But it can be really problematic, it can be really temperamental, and for us, the best F40 to have is the earliest and purest form, a non-cat, non-adjust. Often you'll hear us referring to 7 Series F40s, which are those really early cars. Hopefully between the first and the first 300 cars built would be a chassis number that the last 5 digits start with a 7. In about
Buah, pues los que son las primeras 30 unidades deben valer una pasta, F40.
about 1990, we start to see them starting with an 8, and thereafter they go on. They aren't built sequentially, because obviously there are lots of other road Ferraris that slot into within those chassis numbers. But as we said, there were over 1,300 cars built in the end, including at the end the run that was built for the USA of just over 200 cars, which had slightly different front and rear bumpers, if you like, that were added. Crash impact protection in the front and the rear. They were all cat cars. They had a different front splitter. They They had different seats. They had an automatic seatbelt system that reached over your shoulder and helped link it up for you. They had knee impact protection on the sill, on the
Vaya porquería la versión americanas, tío.
underside of the dash, and a few other different features such as that. But we're going to focus on the cars that we have here in Europe, and we're going to focus today on this car primarily, which is a non-cat, non-adjust. It's a 7 Series car, and we're going to have a little walk around to understand how you live with an F40, what you need to know, and how you use and enjoy it. So we find ourselves here in the deconditioning storage facility.
¿Sabes qué pasa? Estos coches que sí, que valen mucha pasta. Pero valen mucha pasta si tienen unas características, ¿eh? Si está repintada la carrocería y tal, devalúa muchísimo. Piensa que estos coches venían de fábrica con una capa finísima de pintura y se le veía toda la fibra de carbono y la textura del Kevlar. Y mucha gente lo mandaba a imprimir y repintar, cágate, para que no se viera el mallado, porque no le gustaba. En aquella época no molaba. Y claro, eso devaluó muchísimo el coche. El chasis el chasis a la antigua, ¿eh?
Most people, is the fact that this is a steel chassis frame. A lot of people make the mistake thinking it's a carbon or a Kevlar tub, which it's not. This is a very, very similar design to a 308, to a 512 Boxer, or even to a Dino in the centre here, with these 3 main chassis tubes of oval orientation.
Ah, coño, yo pensé que tiene un monocasco de carbono, tío. Hostia.
Laid out with your cross
Pensaba que era una bañera, la parte inferior, ya, y luego atornillado todo el chasis tubular.
tubes, your tubes for your seats to fit on, all of those details. So in the front here, we've got bonded in this Kevlar front bulkhead. And that's how this chassis was reinforced and stiffened. They would wrap the whole of the chassis frame, so in the door sill area here, which when you open a normal F40, you see that big Kevlar sill. It's wrapped around this steel frame. And all of it was bonded together, so the roof was bonded onto this frame. These panels are aluminium, the windscreen pillars. They sit in place. And all of this was designed to
Claro, que es que el paso de la entrada reducido por la tapa de Kevlar y pensé que era una bañera, tío.
make the car torsionally more rigid, stiffer. At the back of the car, we've got this a V8 engine, which instead of being transverse in the 308, has been put back to a traditional orientation, so it's longitudinal. And off the back of it is this drop gear gearbox. So this meant that the weight could be lowered and the gearbox weight could be moved right back in the chassis so that they could optimize weight distribution. So the power comes out of the engine, through the gearbox to the drop gears at the back, and then back through to power the wheels here, where the differential is in the middle. On the side here, you'll see the traditional Ferrari red cam covers originating from the Testarossa
Sí, las testas rosas, sí, la cabeza roja. Las tapas estas de balancines.
as inspiration from the 1950s. We've got the exhaust manifolds here, and just here would be where the
Hostia, tradicionalmente los escapes de Ferrari han sido una basura, ¿eh? Sobre todo los conectores, ¿eh?
turbos bolt on. And in the middle here, this would be where our wastegate sits. Now this car is a non-cat, non-adjust, so you'll see this bar here is flat. On a later car, when the cats were added, the cats sit in the exhaust system here. And what that means is that the wastegate is pushed up in height, and therefore we have to have this bent bar, as we call it. And on the underside of the rear clamshell, you'll
Interesante concepto estas diferencias, tío.
see lots more heat insulation,
Las diferencias entre la versión catalizada y sin catalizar, ¿sabes?
lots more ducting pipework to keep it all cool in the engine bay, because of course
No, no son suyos. Él tiene un taller de restauración y de mantenimiento de coches de lujo, sobre todo especializado en Ferrari, ya desde la generación de su padre, desde los 70. Y luego tiene un centro para almacenar unidades de clientes, ¿no? Porque debe trabajar un montón con gente de los países estos del petróleo, de los petrodólares, y los guarda ahí.
those
Me parece que este tío, es el tío que más F40s vende al año en el mundo.
two cats are two things to get much hotter.
Por eso en el taller siempre tiene F40s, restaurando mantenimiento y aquí en el depósito pues tiene un montonazo.
Whilst we've got this spare chassis frame here as well, it's good to show you where the fuel cells would
Bueno, no, el seguro del edificio este, bueno, lo que paga el tío, que paga millones de euros al año.
40. Being very much of a race car or a race car derived design, they had rubber fuel cells. These rubber fuel cells typically have a 10-year lifespan, or if for the
Esto es un fastidio muy grande, tío. Los depósitos de combustible estos de goma, que dice él que es propio de carreras, que se caducan y luego has de mandar que te construyan nuevos a medida, porque tiene una forma específica según cada modelo. Vale un dineral y esto le pasa al McLaren F1. Cada X años, aunque el coche no lo muevas, has de mandar quitar el depósito de gasolina y mandar construir una medida para ti, que te cuesta un dineral. Es un fanón. Por eso el gordo Murray en el nuevo T50, el heredero del McLaren F1, ha dicho nada. El tío ha querido simplificar mucho las movidas del F1 en mantenimiento y ha puesto un depósito de coche normal.
the track use, they have a 5-year guarantee from manufacturers, but we recommend to change tanks every 10 years. And that means that you have to take the rear suspension off the car, so the rear suspension would fit here and here, so your wheels would sit here at the back of the car. You'd have to remove that, and the fuel tanks slide in and out of this section here, and one sits here and one sits on the other side. They're connected
Claro, te está diciendo el mantenimiento que tienen estos coches, ¿sabes?
by a balance pipe. There's a fuel filler on the bodywork on each side of the car, so you can fuel up from either side and it will fill both tanks because they're
Fíjate el trabajo de restauración que ha hecho este F40, que este es lo que ha dicho él de las primeras 30 unidades, de los auténticos F40, de los brutos, más ligeros. Y sí, el bicromatado este que ha hecho, el cincado este bicolor, este dorado, que veis aquí, que yo lo quería replicar, pero claro, por temas de contaminación y normativa europea, de químicos, ya no se puede hacer bicromatado este, o qué nombre tenía, no me acuerdo ya, no me acuerdo cómo se llamaba, el proceso químico para dar este efecto dorado con ton rosado a metales, ¿no? Para que no se oxide, ya no es el mismo que se hacía antes, ¿sabes? Es complicado replicarlo. Tampoco soy muy experto, pero bueno, por encima lo puedo contar. Pues todo restaurado, tío. Muy, muy bonito, Sobre todo la restauración, lo interesante es que muchas restauraciones sobre restauran, ¿me explico? Modifican. Lo quieren dejar todo tan bonito que se pasan. Entonces ya no es... dices que el coche de fábrica no era así, no venía así. O sea, es que muchas veces pintan color aluminio las piezas del motor, las carcasas, las cajas de cambio, lo barnizan, queda precioso, pero claro, de fábrica no es así el coche.
connected by a pipe. And the American cars did not have fuel cells. They actually had aluminium tanks, as well as their crash reinforcement at the rear, at the front, across the sides and in the sills, which ultimately made them heavier, as well as being all cat.
Sí, mi F40, Lolito. Bueno, me enteré que en Granollers, cerca de Barcelona, había un F40 piezas desmontado. De un tío que lo quiso restaurar y se cansó y lo dejó ahí tirado en su almacén, en su empresa. Y me parece recordar que pedía 70.000 euros por el coche. Te hablo, pues hará cerca de 20 años, 18 años hará o así. Claro, yo me volví loco cuando lo escuché. Y yo debía ser un chaval de, no sé, de 24 años o 22, 3 años, no me acuerdo. Claro, yo sabía que eso en el futuro valdría una locura. Y lo quería comprar como sea. Lo que pasa, claro, tenía esa... Era muy joven, todo me superaba, nunca había pedido un crédito del banco, no sé cómo se hacía. Que el banco pide un crédito. En la época que te dan créditos con lo loco, no te piensas que me hubiesen dado problemas. Pero era complicado, porque claro, cuando eres joven y dices, no, me quiero comprar en C40 piezas, la gente se ríe de ti, me acuerdo. Dice, estás loco, pero ¿qué dices, niño? El niño está tonto, ¿no? Luego me enteré que lo estuve buscando, No, me costó mucho encontrar información, pero cuando ya empezaba ya a ubicarlo, me dijeron, no, al final lo montó, pagó para que lo montara y lo vendió por 120.000 euros a un inglés, ¿no? Imagínate. Ahora se pagan, bueno, depende de la unidad, tiene que estar bien, pero entre 1 y 2 millones de euros por un F40. Luego vi en Autoscout un suizo, 170.000 pedía. Era la versión prototipo, era las versiones primeras de las 30 unidades, de sin catalizador, sin regulación de amortiguador, con las puertas esas sin embellecedor de carbono, ¿no? Sí, con la cuerda esa. Y fíjate lo devaluado que están los F40, imagínate. Bueno, Aquel tipo no tanto, ¿eh? O sea, estaban ya... Se paga un poquito más que antes. Pero había puesto un volante Touring de estos planos por abajo, ¿no? Y le había puesto pegatinas fuera, en la puerta, imagínate. ¿Mm? Y pilla 170.000, que seguro que el tío lo vendió por menos, ¿eh? Pero bueno. Seguro que vendió por 150.000, 160.000.
cars, so slightly less.
Que de un día para otro luego subieron 1.000.000 euros. Pero bueno, hablando con un colega, con el José, que le he propuesto entrevistar en el canal. Así, coño, si espabila, que es un historiador de coches. Lo hablamos él y yo y me lo decía, de John, si es que no había que ser un genio para predecir eso, digamos, ¿eh? Si ya lo sabía. Este que está tapado, ¿esto qué es? Diría que es un La Ferrari, ¿no? Por la forma, sí, diría que es la Ferrari, ¿verdad?
Power and, of course, aluminium tanks. Moving to the front of the chassis, we've got this removed.
Claro, esto era un coche con unas prestaciones descomunales, pero si empiezas a sumar peso y a poner catalizador y tal, y luego la gasolina 91 octanos de Estados Unidos, la versión estadounidense debe tirar mucho más que la europea.
Movable subframe on the front suspension sitting here, steering rack on the front. If we look in the front here, you can see a real example of how all of the Kevlar was used and bonded with this green, which people would think is a flexible putty, but it's actually a solid epoxy resin that was bonded in to the webbing of the steel frame, and all of that was just to stiffen up the chassis, to use that lightweight Kevlar to stiffen it up. Of course, this is not carbon fibre, it's an earlier type of material, Kevlar, but it's a very, very similar product and was much more popular or used much more in the 70s and 80s until carbon fibre really took off. In the
Vale. El F40 no tiene fibra de carbono. Yo pensaba que sí, es todo Kevlar.
front here, normally we have the spare wheel well sitting here, which we'll see on another car later. But as you can see, underneath that spare wheel well, this is
El diseño de la geometría de amortiguador a lo clásico, ¿eh? No tiene nada de... No tiene... No, me hago lío. Los push rods se llaman. Los amortiguadores horizontales.
where the battery sits. And interestingly, the adjustable suspension was not an afterthought on the F40. It was definitely something they were thinking about doing from the beginning, because even the very earliest non-cat, non-adjust cars will have these brackets here. So this bracket here is for one of the reservoirs for the adjustable suspension.
Un F50 GT, el que está tapado. Hombre, no. Creo que hay 2 unidades, ¿no? De F50, o 4 o 5 de F50 GT. Los coches más raros que hay, ¿eh?
System where the fluid's held at pressure, and just here is where some of the electronics and things sit.
Mira, un día podemos hablar, el coche más bajo de la historia, que el deportivo más bajo, el de naranja mecánica, el Durango, ¿os acordáis? Que es de chasis de madera.
And you'd also have another ECU sitting up here for the adjustable suspension. So it wasn't an afterthought, but it was never fitted to the non-cat, non-adjust early cars. The chassis number of an F40 is stamped into the frame here. You'll also find it on the top of the steering column. So typically when we put cars on our...
¿Sabíais vosotros, que yo sepa, que los chasis desnudos tienen un montón de elementos de identificación, un montón de códigos? Aparte del código BIN, el código legal que identifica la unidad, luego tiene como unos números o unos símbolos sueltos troquelados por alrededor del chasis, ¿lo sabíais? Siempre hablo de oídas, ¿eh? No soy experto. Hostia, pero estos frenos, tío, son de acero. Pero tiene ese acero como muchísimo carbono o algo así, ¿no? Porque tiene una apariencia muy, ¿cómo decirlo? Muy mate, tío. Restauración, tope.
rolling road, we'll find that a cat car has around about 480 brake horsepower, and that a non-cat car with a sports exhaust will have close to 500 horsepower, which, given the weight...
¡Wow! 500 caballos, no catalizado con escape deportivo, 500 caballos, ¿eh? O sea, este coche piensa que entre que tiene marchas larguísimas, que es una caca, y tiene un turbolag descomunal, las prestaciones en papel no se corresponden con las sensaciones, porque es un coche que abajo no tiene un pimiento, y luego te pega una patada descomunal, y la marcha larga, o sea, acelera mucho en muy poco espacio. Es lo que pasa con los coches de los 80 o el 930 Turbo también, de 911. Que pudieran parecer que, hombre, corren. No. Condúcelo porque en un E30 turbo, sobre todo el del primer año, ya se exagera que no tiene intercooler, no acelera, ¿no? Y te gana todo el mundo. Pero luego con Delta al turbo te pega un patadón y ese tiempo que has perdido lo recuperas, ¿no? Entonces las sensaciones son muy, muy extremas, tío.
Is an astonishing power to weight ratio, especially given the time. And even by today's standards, that feels very fast, very modern. But what really lets an F40 down is the original brake setup. The discs and pads squeal like hell when you're slowing down at low speeds. The design of the wheels means that they can't cool down that much, so brake fade after repetitive heavy hits, if you're on track for example, is really bad. But our solution has been...
Ya, claro, es que esas llantas creo que eran Campagnolo, creo que eran las llantas F40 muy bonitas, pero no refrigeran nada y dice que eso provoca un deterioro muy fuerte de los frenos.
to develop this ceramic disc and pad conversion.
Ah, vale. Claro, decía yo, esto es cerámico. Pues no me atrevía a decirlo. Dice un F40 con frenos cerámicos, pero cerámicos, no carbono metálicos, ¿no? Como los que llevan los primeros Porsches con la pinza amarilla. No, esto es cerámico, pero bueno, pero bestia,
That beautifully fits within the size of the standard wheel, and the pad fits inside the standard caliper. So it's a really good solution to bring the cars up to almost modern day standards, massively improving them. We've also...
Me encanta el rest mode, bueno, esto no es rest mode exactamente, pero ya entendéis, me encanta coger un coche clásico, antiguo, con 30, 40 años de antigüedad, que tiene esa característica genuina de los coches de antes, que no tienen ahora ni de broma, pero los defectos catastróficos de diseño que pudieran tener, porque antes era todo analógico, no se hace con ordenadores, se hacía todo dibujando en papel, imagínate, y con matemática, calculadora, etcétera, ¿no? Pues como este coche, que tiene unos frenos que son un desastre, frenos de carbono, pero carbono, a lo bestia, no carbono metálicos, ¿no? O sea, me parece una calidad bestial, adaptados, conservando la pinza original, flipante, tío, una cosa maravillosa. Igual que los amortiguadores, o sea, quitas ese amortiguador que iba asqueroso, le metes unos amortiguadores de 8, 10, 15 mil euros diseñados para este coche. Con especificación un poco de calle también, y vamos, eso va que flipas. Conservas lo bueno de ahora con las características de antes, ¿no?
developed our own lifting system so we can replace the shock and spring with a air-powered front lift system that's instantaneous. It can be fitted at the rear as well, so you can have all four wheels or just the front.
Qué crack el pavo este. Y te quita la basura de ese sistema hidráulico y te mete un sistema por aire instantáneo y fiable para elevar las 4 ruedas, tipo pasar por los badenes.
Which is a great solution to make the cars much more usable in the modern day environment without having to rely on what has become quite unreliable original technology of the factory adjustable suspension system. Another thing just to quickly point out, which I know has been pointed out by other people in other videos, are the suspension markings that you'll find on the top of the wishbones here, which often get washed away over time, but it's nice to see them on cars. Other than that, that is the F40 laid bare. I don't think it would be possible to see one in a rawer form. There weren't many options available on the F40. As we've mentioned, the latest
Espero que no metan strike por usar su contenido, que hay canales que lo hacen, ¿eh? Y luego tengo que recurrir al rollo.
cars, you could choose adjustable suspension on the cat cars only, but something that was available throughout the range was Perspex sliding windows or Lexan windows. And it's a bit of a common myth that the first 50 cars were fitted with Lexan windows. That's not the case whatsoever. However, if we looked at the complete production range of the F40, the majority of the cars that did leave the factory with Lexan windows were very early cars. And I think it's probably safe to say that people probably realised after delivery that they were particularly impractical, as they are just plastic sliding windows, which...
O sea, era opcional, la gente se pedía las ventanas de esta plexiglas y no se dan cuenta que no era práctico, si eso es lo peor que hay.
mean that you can't actually lock them. They're quite susceptible to jamming, breaking and scratching. However, the nice thing about the Lexan windows means that the inside of the door doesn't have a Kevlar panel to cover up the...
Ah, estaba confundido. Yo pensaba que el panel de Kevlar embellecedor venía solo en las segunda generación de F40s. Hostia, pues no es... Hostia, pues nos deja... Pues yo jugaría que había las versiones sin panel de Kevlar, así todo visto, pero que se pudiera levantar el cristal con él, pues no.
wind-up mechanism. it has this bare, lightweight, body-coloured panel, which is a really sort of sexy nod to the prototypes, as they were all the same as well. Something else that was done during production was for a very VIP customer of Ferrari and Pininfarina.
Una cosa que hicieron durante la producción para un cliente muy VIP de Ferrari. Sé que es el sultán de Brunei. Imagínate, para que Ferrari tenga un cliente muy VIP, si todos los clientes de Ferrari deben ser lo más top.
7 or so cars were sent to Pininfarina, like this car, and they were totally rebuilt in right-hand drive specification. And this is one of those 7. This car is in the colour that it was painted by Pininfarina for that particular client. Every single car was to a different specification. And as I mentioned, they were totally rebuilt, converted to right-hand drive, when they were practically new cars as well, and quite often featured lavish leather interior, sometimes Testarossa seats, full stereo systems, adjustable steering columns, and those cars are super, super special. And only 2 of them are outside of that collection that those 7 cars were built for in period. But other than that,
Hicieron 7 F40 especiales para Sultán de Brunei, que cuando salía del año de producción ya el coche finalizado, tenía que volver a Pininfarina, a una línea artesanal, a desmontar el coche completamente, lo pasaron a volante a la derecha, lo repintaron, algunos le metían cuero, otros sistemas de sonido, bueno, tal.
no real options were available.
Buah, lo que están cotizados esos coches, ¿eh? Y los tiene pudriéndose el tío, el Sultán de Brunei, que tiene, no sé si tiene miles de coches y los tiene pudriéndose.
But let's get back to the car and start looking at how we use it. First of all, keys. So every F40 should be delivered with a lovely DK engineering keyring.
Tío, que está acá las llaves encima del coche, alejado del coche, hombre.
Because you should buy it from us. But 2 sets of keys with 3 keys on each set. The first is your ignition key. This is a bendable key and lift at the same time, like I said, so it doesn't bend and flex.
Este tío cuida todos los detalles, ¿eh? El dueño este. Todas las salas tienen iluminación preciosa para que se vean los coches espectaculares, ¿eh?
Pull it all the way forwards. There are cables to hold it forwards. And just be careful in the wind that this doesn't blow closed. So here we are in the front. We find our spare wheel well. Now, an F40 never had a spare wheel, but it is big enough to fit a front. In the middle here, we've got this battery.
Ah, curioso, hicieron un espacio para meter rueda de repuesto y no la pusieron nunca, ¿no? Cosa de italiano, ¿no? Hostia, que mi batería más pequeña.
Place it on trickle charge whilst it's not being used. Under the reservoirs here, we have the battery cut-off switch. So you turn it clockwise to turn the battery off and anti-clockwise to turn it on. All F40s had that fitted there.
Hostia, el interruptor de batería es lo mejor que hay, tío. Sobre todo para los coches que no usas, ¿sabes?
The top here and fill it up with fluid. Skidoni, this lovely Skidoni wallet, which quite often some of the original owners.
Bueno, mira, te compras F40, te regalaban una cartera de cuero. Bueno, hostia, qué bonito, ¿no? Claro, es lo que decía, en F40 te tiene que incluir todas estas cositas cuando lo compras, porque si no va devolviendo el coche progresivamente. Mira qué bonito, tío. Esto es una calidad espectacular, ¿eh? Joder. Encima a medida para encajar los huecos del coche. Ah, claro, la maleta está redonda, cabe en el maletero. Y estoy seguro que un montón de F40s no conservan todo eso. No lo tienen. Y mira que esa maleta, la redonda, está diseñada específicamente para que encaje perfecto en el hueco del delantero, ¿eh? Hostia, y está virgen el cuero, ¿eh? ¿Os dais cuenta que no tiene ningún roce? Bueno, el de mano sí. El del papeleo está desgastado, descolorido, normal. Pero los otros... Hostia, está impecable, ¿eh? No se ha usado nunca, tío.
Piece. Now, the finish and the way in which this is painted in here will change through the course of chassis numbers from early to late cars. Also, sometimes on the very early cars, this front wheel well is a slightly different design in the way it's made, but it's only ever so slight. But all of these little things help us point towards whether cars are correct or not. Equally, another item that's sometimes different under the front here are the shapes of these brake cooling ducts and the actual ducts on the suspension themselves. The very famous body numbers can be found under some covers under the front clam here as well. Before I close the front clam, I'm just going to show you this panel here. This often is the area that gets damaged when someone tries to shut the clam on their own and they allow it to flex. So again, Ethan will help me close the front. Now,
Hostia, este tío sabe todo. Tienes que cerrar el maletero entre dos personas porque si no se flexa y golpea la carrocería. Interesante, ¿eh?
if I was
¿Veis el brillo aquí que hace? Si estuvieras más cerca verías el mallado este, el Kevlar. Esto es algo importante también en la cotización del vehículo, ¿sabes?
bound to be on my own, I'd want to make sure that I could lift it in one place only from the middle and let it come down level, not holding it just one side, because then the grille on this side would damage the bodywork on the other side. But luckily I've got Ethan here helping me. So we push it down and just much like when we're opening it, one palm down on here, close it, then go to lock it. As I've already mentioned, we have a fuel filler on each side, and that's because we have a fuel cell sitting on either side of the engine. As we get all the way up, then Ethan comes in to help. So it's really important to do this slowly and carefully. Outside of the car, you get the pole to line up, you slide it into position. It's always tricky because they are
Voy a coñazo, tío. Montar el palo ese.
a terrible design.
Sí, sí, diseño de mierda, dice. Fíjate, para ahorrar los amortiguadores estos que frenan el capó, ¿sabes? Imagínate, para ahorrar peso, ¿eh?
Once we've lined it up with the hole,
Que ya es tú lo que pesa dos amortiguadores estos de maletero. Y más para un capó de Kevlar que no pesa nada, ¿eh?
there we go. And then it sits there, supports the rear end. So whilst we've got the engine bay open like this, I just wanted to go back to the differences between a cat car and a non-cat car. So in my mind, there are 6 major differences between the two. Number 1, the most obvious. 2 catalytic converters on the exhaust system, which sit in this area here. Number 2 creates the wastegate sitting higher, and therefore we have a bent bar on top of the wastegate instead of this flat bar. This
ya veo.
is a non-cat car,
Sí,
of
sí,
course.
sí.
Number 3, the air filter boxes are rotated through 90 degrees on a cat car and are painted silver.
No lo sabía.
Number 4, different ducts. So on the cat car down there, we have is that the gearbox is different, so it produces less power, and also the emissions of the cat car that sits underneath here, and a bigger cooling duct that sits here. Number 5 is that the gearbox has a different ratio in second gear. And why is that? That's so that the 0 to 60 is as fast as a non-cat car on a cat car, because on a cat car, number 6, the cam timing is different, so it produces less power, and also the emissions are kinder to the environment. As I've already mentioned, there are quite a few subtle differences between production of the early cars and later cars, and these changed along the way. So for me, when looking at an F40, it helps me determine whether the car's original or not, because I look at, first of all, what the chassis number is, and therefore where it lies in the range.
Sí, pero también luego de F40 había un montón de unidades, sobre todo las primeras me parece. Había unas que se llamaban las papel maché, creo que era un término francés, que eran los de carrocería más fina, eran los más ligeros de todos, los más radicales. Hay un montón de cosas diferentes en el mundo este de coleccionismo de F40 que determina su valor.
Is what I would call an 82,000 series car. So the first 2 digits of the last 5 digits of the chassis number start 82. So it's not a 7 series car, it's not super early. But by the fact that it has no assembly number plaque here, that says to me that it's one of the first 400 cars built, which quite often for the collector and for me, I like to try and aim to buy one of those very early cars, as they were fundamentally the cars that Enzo originally intended to produce, and most likely this.
Está interesante lo que dice, claro. Para el coleccionista puro y duro, busca el F40 más viejo posible, más cercano a la idea de Enzo Ferrari, ¿no?
Chassis frame would have been made whilst he was still alive.
En otros modelos se busca el más moderno, el último de producción, porque está más mejorado. Este no, curioso, ¿eh? Este coche, cuanto más último es, peor, entre comitas. Y la gente está alargando el directo, veo que no le gusta el tema este.
You'll see this iconic exhaust system. You'll remember from the Burago models that we all had as a kid, that was the standard system. Of course, it's over-silenced, and as standard, an F40 sounds
Coño,
terrible.
que he baneado al cuadrado. Cuadrado, que te he baneado. No. Uy, menos mal, perdón, ¿eh? Cuadrado, que te he baneado. Joder, macho, ahora cómo lo recupero. Ahora, espera un momento, ¿eh? Quería banear un bot. Me oye, cuadrado, que quería banear. Cago en la puta, espérate. Quería banear al tío este, se va a entrar un bot ahí. Ahora, hombre. Vale, menos mal.
In fact, and needs a sports exhaust. But today, originally intended to produce iconic exhaust system. You'll remember from the Burago models that we all had as a kid, that was the standard system. Of course, it's oversized.
Hostia, es verdad, tío. Los coches estos de Burago, ¿te acordáis? Que la hacían. Que teníamos todos los niños uno en casa. Que en los 80 era lo más tener esa maqueta de F40. Y nos llamaba la atención que puedes levantar el capó trasero y veías el escape, ¿no? Lo que dice él.
Silenced, and as standard, an F40 sounds really terrible, in fact, and needs a sports exhaust. But today, it's really important to try and make sure that your car comes with this standard exhaust, even if it just sits on the shelf in your garage. You see the
No lo sabía, dice que el escape se suena como un truño y que es mejor poner un escape deportivo. Y bueno, pero que es muy importante tenerlo original, ese escape que es muy raro, y guardarlo.
coolers mounted up high here. On the early cars, these are finished in raw aluminium, but as we move into these 8 Series cars and onwards, they're painted and finished in this silver paint as opposed to raw aluminium. You've got the classic inlet plenum there in that soft silver. Sometimes you see that they've been painted red or that someone has painted the Ferrari in red. This one is totally plain silver, as it should be. We have the Lexan rear screen here, which has...
Es verdad que sí, que los intercoolers, yo estoy acostumbrado, bueno, muchas veces lo he visto en los vídeos, el aluminio, ese guarro con la oxidación superficial, y ese está pintado, le da un aspecto más civilizado.
Inlet plenum there in that soft silver. Sometimes you see that they've been painted red or that someone has painted the Ferrari in red. This one is totally plain silver, as it should be. We have the Lexan rear screen here, which has 2 lines of vents. Of course, Bob Houghton in the late 80s, early 90s produced a limited run of 3 vents so that when you looked out your rear view mirror, you had better visibility. So quite often on some of the UK cars that have been here for a long time, you see that, which is a very English thing, nice thing to see. And as you...
Hostia, el cristal trasero, bueno, no es un cristal, el Lexan este que tienes aquí del capó motor, que con el calor se amarillea cuando es un F40 y tiene... Claro, pues pasó uno por mi pueblo, me acuerdo, cuando eran tan caros, tenía la rejilla trasera, de aquí donde van los pilotos, con que es metálico pintado, pues está todo oxidado. Y, hola Poppy, y entonces el plástico este, el Lexan este de aquí, el motor, también estaba amarillo, por el calor del motor, hostia, un F40, si no te gastas la pasta, queda feo, ¿eh?
may have seen on some other F40 videos if you've watched
F40, que yo sepa, está entre 1 y 2 millones de euros.
them. You've got stampings much like the front suspension on the rear suspension here, so I don't need to go into that. Often we look...
También te digo que esto es lo que supuestamente valen, y luego un F40 que no esté bien mantenido, que esté repintado, que esté tuneado, que falten piezas, etcétera, ves bajando el precio, ¿eh? O sea, ¿qué pasa en el mundo este? Esto es lo de siempre. Pasa lo mismo con los videojuegos clásicos, ¿no? Sale el Spine Car, ¿habéis visto? Mi colección, solo Neo Geo tengo 100.000 euros. Y se pone a ver en eBay los precios, ¿no? Y bueno, esto es lo que pide la gente, no lo que vale. Lo que vale es lo que se paga, ¿vale? La gente por pedir, pide. Y un F40 sí, entre 1 o 2 millones de euros, pero si está repintado, imagínate, mal pintado, ¿eh? Si ha tenido alguna torta, que es lo más normal del mundo, y más reparado, que le falta un montón de piezas originales, búscalas, no encontrarás. Ese coche ya no vale, vamos, yo no creo que valga ni medio millón de euros. Yo. Otra cosa, que la desesperación de la gente se calienta y tal, y quiero F40, y te acaba pagando 700.000 euros, y ellos piensan, me pilla una ganga, y te pilla una mierda. Te pilla una mierda porque un F40, bueno, todos los coches clásicos valen pasta si están bien. Mira, esto es lo mismo que esto, mira. Esto a todos nos gusta mucho, esto. El bola dragón de Super Nintendo. Pero en verdad, mira cómo está. ¿Me explico? Ahora la gente dice, hay burbuja de videojuegos clásicos, igual que los coches clásicos. Hay burbuja de basura, lo que hay. O sea, pagar una pasta por esto es una tontería. Esto tiene que valer, no sé, 70 euros. Depende de las cantidades que haya, por supuesto. Lo que vale es la unidad de esto que esté impecable, ¿no? Porque eso es rarísimo. Yo estoy igual, el F40 que vale. El F40 que vale es el que esté, pues, que tenga el Kevlar visto en la pintura, que guarda las maletas en buen estado. Ve sumando, ¿no? Lo típico, no, es que le han cambiado el escape, uno que suena bien de verdad, y el escape original, no lo tiré, pero está hecho polvo. Lo tiraste, pues ve sumando. Ese es el primero Super Nintendo que salió.
Look at the foil on the rear valance here to see that it's the original pattern, as it's impossible to replicate. Not unreasonable that it might have been replaced, especially if you've had a clutch change and the gearbox has been out of the car. And when you look at the back here, you see that the engine sits right in what is effectively a rear subframe. It's not removable like the 288 GTO, it's a fixed subframe which helps with rigidity again, less bolts, solidly mounted, makes for a stiffer car. And the suspension hangs off the back of the chassis there. The gearbox hangs right out the back here. We've got the engine mounts on show. You can see the rear anti-roll bar here. As I mentioned, adjustable suspension will have some sensors on here to measure what the ride height is currently running at when they're driving along. You've got two coolers here, so one is for the gearbox and one is for the engine oil cooling.
Está bien, tiene radiador de aceite para la caja de cambios. No todos los coches tienen, así deportivos.
And these are both fed from vents from the NASA ducts on the top of the clamshell. You've got the rear lights at the back here, this rear grille which is very susceptible to going rusty because it gets very
Ya he dicho aquí que se oxida muchísimo esa rejilla.
very hot because of the exhaust, and then if you drive the car in any sort of damp weather, the water goes straight onto here and evaporates immediately, causing them to corrode very quickly. But again, not a big deal. And then often you'll see that these latches corrode very quickly because the water just sits inside there. You've got the sensors here for the lighting system, and that's about it. Again, going back to the fuel cells. So the fuel cells sit behind these panels here, so you have to take the wheel off, you have to take the rear suspension off, then you can remove that panel and get at the fuel tanks to change them. Cam belts for the servicing are accessed from the inside of the car, so unlike a 348 or a 355 where you have to drop the engine out to change the cam belt.
Es curioso este coche. ¿Se puede hacer la distribución? La correa, pensé que tenía cadena. Sí, no, que van con correa, sí. Se puede hacer la correa de distribución desde el interior del habitáculo. Quitas los asientos, quitas la tapa que hay y ya tienes ahí para meter. Cuando normalmente los Ferrari tienes que bajar el motor entero para abajo.
Belts. In fact, you just move the seats forwards, you remove a panel, and you can access the cam belts from there. And finally, oil. If you're brave enough to want to try and check your own oil level, this is a dry sump oil system, and the oil filler is in the corner here. So now we'll try and close the rear clamshell. So again, one person to lift and drop.
Es verdad que muchos coches tienen un método para llenar aceite que te mueres. O sea, metido ahí en el fondo del motor, que dices, ¿cómo he hecho aceite? Y sobre todo, ¿cómo lo hago sin llenar todo el motor de aceite? Que si se te derrama, va al escape, en principio no tiene que prenderse fuego. Pero vaya gracia que se prenda fuego. Pero te hará una humareda que te mueres y encima es un motor de cárter seco. Por lo que tienes que hacer la medición con el motor encendido y en caliente. O sea, un coñazo, tío.
It down to stop that twisting, and this is the time when it's a real problem because these edges.
O sea, este hombre que es el dueño del taller, me imagino cuando un mecánico, cuando el todo está restaurado perfecto, cuando le echa aceite y se le escape y caiga abajo, dices, tío, si el coche está restaurado, está perfecto, ahora hay que hacer, bajar el motor para limpiarlo, tío. Dios mío.
On the inner rear wheel arch.
Este tío tiene que ser muy cabrón necesariamente, ¿eh? Si no, aparte de selección de persona muy buena, tienes que ser cabrón, ¿eh? Porque el trabajador, esto que voy a decir va a ser un poco gordo. El trabajador no puede decir, ha sido un accidente. Y además yo hago mi jornada de 8 horas, así que no me rayo. No. O sea, si hemos restaurado el coche, me has volcado aceite todo por el motor para abajo, baja el motor, lo bajas, lo limpias, luego lo subes. Que me tengo que ir. Pues ponte a hacerlo, tío. O sea, este coche tiene que entregarse el viernes, que viene el tío de Arabia Saudí a recogerlo. ¿Te imaginas? Ponte a hacer horas como un cabrón. Hombre, tío, es que en mi taller, me acuerdo, se ha caído. Se ha caído, ¿no? Las deja caer tú, gilipollas. Las cosas no se caen solas. Las has puesto a la mesa de manera que se cayera.
The ends of the rear anti-roll bar links. So That's really important, otherwise they catch on there, it makes a nasty noise, it can take a nick out of the Kevlar. So first of all, I'll need my help from Ethan again, but I will lift this up. So Ethan, if you come over. So I'll lift this up and Ethan will take the bar, dismantle it, and there are two clips here so that when it's pulled apart, you can push it down and it does not exist. Buying an F40 will always be, and there we are. Just before we dive into the interior and the running instructions of an F40, let's have a quick chat about paint. So, with regards to an F40, the perfect car does not exist. Buying an F40 will always be about making a compromise, and that's whether it's mileage, whether it's servicing history, ownership history, specification, or...
A lo que dice él, lo que os decía. Comprar un F40 perfecto no existe. O el mantenimiento lo ha hecho en la casa de Pepe, Manolo, el mecánico, flipa, ¿eh? Kai, hombre, gracias por suscribirte, tío, 6 meses. Muchas gracias por suscribirte. Suscribiros, hombre, que hace tiempo que nadie se suscribe al canal. O la Antonea, lo que sea, lo que dice. Encontrar una unidad perfecta es prácticamente imposible. Y lo que se debe pagar.
Or indeed, paint. A lot of people will look for and ask for weave. And this weave is basically where the paint has settled over time. And because we're not dealing with a metal surface, a perfectly smooth surface, we're dealing with effectively a fabric, a hard fabric, the Kevlar. The paint settles and it creates a texture to the paint that even sometimes when you run your hand across, you'll feel that texture, but certainly you'll see it. So this car, for example.
Claro, esto es, como dice él, una tela de fibra endurecida, que es el Kevlar.
Has lovely weave on the front clam. Now, it's a bit of a myth that every F40 should have weave. We have to remember that these cars were painted by hand. We have to remember that a lot of people complained when the cars were new that the paint quality wasn't good enough because they'd never seen this weave before. So a lot of...
Sí, esto me lo he escuchado, está interesante lo que dice. La gente cuando recibía el coche se quejaba de que estaba pintado porque se veía toda la textura de la fibra. No se veía Estaba acostumbrada la gente al metal liso, con los brillos lisos, y no a ese efecto así de... Que es una tela, como él dice. Está interesante. Y lo mandaba a repintar después.
A lot of cars were repainted at the delivering dealer or even at the factory prior to delivery. But we can see...
Vaya cagada, tío. Me imagino el coche que lo vuelven para atrás a la fábrica, metiendo ahí aparejo por un tubo para dejar efecto metal, efecto liso. Qué desastre, tío.
Weave right the way through the range. It's just very dependent on car to car. So what I'm trying to ascertain here is don't be put off by a car that doesn't have weave. It doesn't necessarily mean that the car has been painted during its life, but it is a really nice thing to try and look for. And in terms of weave, you'll find it on the tops of the front wings here.
Sí, pero ¿vas a pedirle el mismo dinero por un F40 repintado, con aparejo ahí, masilla y todo el rollo, para que esté liso? La pregunta. Este que es un vendemotos te dirá sí, no, 1 millón de euros, ¿eh? Pero vamos, pues cojones. Un F40 vale pasta si está como tiene que estar.
You can find it in the center of the front clam, on the roof, on the tops and the sides of the rear quarters, on the rear spoiler, and a little bit on the rear clamshell. But you have to remember that because of all the ducts and things that are fitted in the rear clamshell, quite often there's a lot of fiberglass due to the nature of the manufacturing process in a rear clamshell, so you won't find weave everywhere there. And the same for the doors. It's very rare to find lots of weave in the side of the doors. You might see it along the top, but no car exists that has every single box ticked. So it is about making a compromise and making sure that you are happy with the car that you're buying and that it ticks perhaps 3 out of 5 boxes for you to the highest level and taking that compromise. Also, the very early cars, again, as I call them, the 7 series chassis numbers, were slightly different in the way they were painted. Most notably, under the front clamshell, the early cars quite often were painted red instead of black. Under the front here, just in front of the front wheels. Under the sills, they were just painted all red, no black. The same under the rear valance here, no black paint, all red, but really only for the very early cars. And the same inside the hinges here for the rear clamshell, there was no black added.
Este tío, cuando le entra el F40, vamos, lo disecciona, ¿eh? Empezará a decir, esta es una unidad tal que tiene pintado esto, pero no lo otro, este tiene opcional esto y lo otro. Madre mía, tío, un experto en F40, ¿eh?
Now the interesting thing is, on the inside we've got a lock as well, and you could lean across and lock from the inside your passenger door, but the outside will still be unlocked, but you won't be able to open it. So you'd have to lean back into the car to unlock it like that if you've locked it from the inside. Just something to bear in mind. Now we're looking at these big Kevlar sills that we've got to get ourselves across. And if you remember on the F40 restoration project earlier on in the video, where we had the bare steel chassis frame there,
Palito, ¿qué quieres decir que son necesarios? ¿En qué sentido necesarios? ¿Qué te refieres?
that then is wrapped in the Kevlar, it really helps you to see this. And again, going back to the early cars, the finish of this Kevlar was much rougher. There was a lot more variety in colour. They were much greyer. Sometimes it looks like it could be worn out. And the later the car, the better the preparation of this Kevlar, especially in the sill area, and the thicker the lacquer. So if you look at a car with a 9 series chassis number, you'll see that the finish is really smart. It's really nicely put together. And that's just purely as development advanced, especially as the cars gained assembly numbers because they moved onto a proper assembly line. The quality control was much deeper. They'd learnt from their mistakes. They'd learnt that people were complaining about the fit of.
Fíjate, estos coches italianos sobre todo, pero también porque son de producción muy artesanal, que de la primera unidad a la última ahí se nota mucho la evolución de la calidad manual del trabajo. Y explica que el Kevlar del habitáculo tenía un barniz gordo, brillante, bonito, y las primeras unidades del Kevlar se ve mate, guarro y como más cortado incluso.
Finish. But again, coming back to these early cars, for me that rough and
Es que cuando ves la fábrica de Ferrari, sobre todo los vídeos antiguos, y la comparas con lo de Porsche, o sea, a primera ya se ve los italianos trabajando muy bruto y los alemanes muy preciso y muy centrado, y no ves un tanto martillazo. Qué diferencia, tío, de manera de trabajar, ¿eh?
ready nature is something that I really like.
Es sorprendente cómo se transmiten las diferencias entre fábricas de coches, ¿eh? Si veis Estados Unidos, Italia, Alemania, como Japón, totalmente distinto, ¿eh?
To find because
Bueno, y si vieras fábricas de coche ingleses, eso parecía ya, o sea, parecía el herrero de tu casa ahí, ¿sabes? Cuando existían las fábricas de ingleses. Qué desastre de gente, tío.
it's lightweight, pure form, no fuss, no too much attention to detail. It's just a pure racing car for the road. But okay, let's get ourselves in. Just before I get in, actually, sorry. This car is fitted with the standard inertia reel belts. Now, not all cars had these from new. You could have harnesses from new. But I do like to find a car that has inertia reel belts because to me it says the car's probably done less track work. Not that track work is an issue, but the less track work, the better in anyone's eyes. So these are the inertia reels that sit here, but you could have harnesses.
Hombre, a mí me mola, a él le gusta que tenga cinturones de estos de inercia. A mí me gusta con arneses, tío. Pero claro, lo que dice, si tiene arneses, posiblemente haya comido mucha pista.
Inside the F40 now. First of all, two things I want to point out in here. One, if you look
Claro,
inside
él dice que no es un problema que el coche haya mamado pista porque el coche te lo restaura hasta la médula, ¿no? Pero bueno.
the inside of the front wheel arch, that's the
Puedo deciros que los F40 cuando los compras lo puedes mandar a Michelotto en Italia, que es el preparador oficial de Ferrari, y te hace lo que quieras el tío ese, pero te pega unos palos a lo italiano, ¿eh? O sea, si quieres mejorar la caja de cambios, los frenos, pero unos precios, pero incluso dentro del mundo este de los superdeportivos y bastante ido, ¿eh? Pero claro, con que es oficial. Pero bueno, prefiero que me lo haga el tío este, seguro que es más barato. Qué raro que tenga quito estas arrugas en el cuadro de mandos, el cuadro de relojes, perdón. No recuerdo el F40 que tiene tanta arruga aquí. Tan mal hecho esto.
area that we were talking about that gets damaged if someone tries to put the clamshell down on their own.
Oh, me encanta, tío, el pomo súper alto, ¿eh?
Kevlar, like it is on this car, unpainted. And it's always a really easy sign of a car that's had a lot of paint. There's quite often some really ugly masking lines.
Hostia, qué bien acabado el detalle este, ¿eh? Es
There's
típico
always a really
y mucho más en coches italianos que las bisagras que hechas polvo, ¿eh?
masking lines in here, so that's easy to see. Also, it's another location for these famous body numbers on the hinges of the door.
Wow, está impecable, ¿eh? No hay nada de óxido, que es un punto que siempre se pudren, que salta la pintura. Joder, tío, qué bien.
But don't be put out if there aren't any, because the very earliest cars wouldn't have had body numbers all round the car, and sometimes not at all, and especially on the doors. But later on into production, all cars would have had body numbers, and the easiest place to find them is on these hinges of the doors. So, here I am sitting in the car. This is a wind-up window car, so we see that it has this Kevlar panel as opposed to the raw red of the cars with the sliding windows. We've got our window winder here, and this cable, believe it or not, is how you open the door. And actually, to close the door, we use this panel. So, from the outside, I'll come back to how we close those, but from the inside, you've just got to do your best to hold it at the bottom and give it a good hard pull and slam to close it. When you look in the mirror, you can see if the bodywork is lining up with the outside of the car. It's not always the perfect fit, but when you know your F40, you know whether it's closed or not. So here we are sitting in the car. The seats are only adjustable forwards and backwards. Note to yourself though, sometimes especially Italian supplied cars, the seats sit on blocks, so they sit a bit higher. But there's a simple lever under the front here to move the seat backwards and forwards. You'll see, personally, at just under 6 foot, I don't have a huge amount of room in here. This is a standard headlining, but also something
Pero este tío es muy alto, 1,85 m así.
we offer is a revised headlining setup so that you can gain about ½ an inch above your head. So we're sitting here in the driver's seat. We've got our ignition barrel here, start button here, air conditioning controls here, yes.
¿Aire acondicionado, un F40?
It does have air conditioning, contrary to
Tío, un aire acondicionado, un F40, no lo sabía, tío, me estás contando. Ah, qué coñazo, ¿no?
popular belief. All F40s have air conditioning.
Joder, ahora me entero, tío. En contra de lo que todo el mundo piensa, los F40 tienen aire acondicionado. Tony, que un 81 justito, vale, vale, gracias por traducirlo. Hostia, me queda parado. Los F40 tienen todos aire acondicionado. Me queda muerto, tío.
You've got the vents for the air conditioning in front of you here and on top of the dash. We've got a bank of switches on the left, which we'll come back to in a minute, and then 3 stalks. So in the centre we have the traditional handbrake, which is a pull up and then push the button in, hold it in and let it down to release the handbrake. The gear lever, we have 5 gears plus reverse, and first is a dogleg first. So clutch down, to the left and backwards, we're in first. They are actually a lovely gearbox.
Sí, esto es una pata de perro que dicen, que la primera va como si fuera marcha atrás y luego la segunda y tercera quedan lineadas, rectas. Que es genial para hacer tramo de curvas.
Perhaps you might want to avoid second gear when it's cold, but once warmed up, should be a beautiful change, just as we want, for a manual car.
Lo malo de estos coches tan potentes que tienen caja de cambios, transmisores tan grandes y pesadas, es que lo que dice, cuando están fríos, las marchas, toda la segunda entra como el culo, tío.
Going back to the air conditioning then, so on the left we have fan speed, which looks like it's a variable speed, but actually it's 3 speeds. 1, 2 or 3, and anti-clockwise, twisting it clockwise takes you from 0 to 3. Then the right-hand dial is the difference between hot and cold.
Me encanta el detalle italiano que han puesto los cuadros es un cuadro con la rueda, 2, pero están pegados totalmente mal puestos, ¿sabes? Que uno está así y otro está así, ¿no? No lo han puesto alineado, perfecto, simétrico, no lo han puesto uno ahí pegado, ya, stranza, questo. Y ha metido otro ahí de cualquier manera. Auténtico italiano, ¿no? Esos detalles acabados, típico italiano, que está todo puesto ahí como el culo, sin interés ninguno.
A bit of a balance, you'll be continually playing.
Y dirán, que es un coche de carrera. No es un coche de carrera, es un coche de calle. Y segundo, tú coges un coche de carrera, es un Porsche, un GT3 Cup o un RSR, y está todo hecho perfecto. Y te pillas un Ferrari de carreras, tío, y el metraquilato cortado de mala manera, las cosas encajan mal, cierran mal.
Playing with it on a hot day, but it does work really well if the air conditioning is properly serviced, properly charged. And you can have the air blowing at you through these 3 vents here and equally blowing at the screen in front of you. Okay, so if we put the ignition key in the ignition, turn it all the way, then we have power on. So talking through the 3 stalks, the easiest one is the small one on the left-hand side, is left for left indicator and right for right indicator. This right-hand stalk is for the wiper, so 2 different speeds, down 1 for the first and second for the second. Now stalk once, to dip, so not to go again, and we turn on. This car being a non-cat, non-adjust, we're missing the last one. And believe it or not, with the 18 F40s that we have sitting here in this building, not a single one is an adjustable suspension car.
Tiene 18 F40s ahí guardados y ninguno con suspensión ajustada. O sea, todos son tipo prototipo, de los primeros que se hicieron. Madre mía, tío. Solo tiene lo mejor el capullo este, ¿eh?
But if it was an adjustable suspension car, on the left here, you'd be able to press the bottom of the button. And I would recommend that whenever you leave your car in storage, that you depressurize the system. And to do that, you would simply press this button 3 times. So 1, 2, 3. Hold it on the 3rd press. This is with the ignition on. And the suspension will drop to the floor. And then you leave it like that. And the next time you go to start the car, it will rise up to its full ride height. And obviously, as you drive along, then it will drop down to the lower ride height. The second one along is for your heated windscreen. So push the top of the button in, and your heated windscreen is straightforward to overhaul them these days. There are lots of people that do it, but definitely something that should be checked when looking at buying a car. Then looking at the rest of the dash here, we've got very simple gauges. On the left here, we've got water temperature that goes up to 120 degrees C. Obviously, we don't want to go above 100. On the left here, we have our speedo, which is in kilometres and shows our recorded mileage in kilometres. Now, all UK F40s were delivered with speedos in kilometres, unless they were a very late car, and then they did introduce a miles per hour speedo, the same for the USA. So probably makes sense that they made those speedos for the US and used them for the later UK cars. But again, that will be on CAT cars only. All non-CAT, non-adjust UK supplied cars will be delivered with a kilometre per hour speedo, and the reading on the top would be in kilometres. Next to it, we have our rev counter with the rev line at 8,000. You rarely need to take it to the red line because of the nature of the turbocharged car. Next to it, we have our boost gauge, which goes up to 1.5. Typically, we'll find that an F40 boosts at around about 1.3 bar. And that gauge, for someone especially that's new to an F40, is really important to keep an eye on. You know, my advice to any new owner of an F40 is to respect the throttles. I told a friend of mine a few months ago, she found hilarious. But you have to respect it. So when you're in first or second gear and you see that boost coming, you need to be ready to back right out of the throttle, because with those twin turbos, when they kick in, it will be a real jerk. And that's where accidents happen in these cars, where people don't expect the boost and they don't respect it and they don't come off as they lose traction, because it just keeps delivering. So that's my number one biggest piece of advice when driving.
Coño. Claro, este coche no son como algunos modernos que regula la inyección automáticamente y la primera va capada para que no te derrape. Este dice que la primera y la segunda, como pises a fondo, el truco te pega una patada que pegas un tromparro, ¿sabes? Si no tienes manos.
An F40 is respect the boost, respect the throttle, predict it's coming in, watch that gauge, and be ready to back right out and be in control of the car. Moving to the next gauge, we have oil temperature, and then we have oil pressure, and finally we have the fuel level gauge, which, you know, a remarkable capacity on these cars, but we would always recommend only ever having them around about half full. Please try to avoid filling your tanks to the brim, and also over a long period of time when the cars are in storage, try to keep the fuel level low. And the first thing you do when you drive the car and it's not been driven for, let's say, 6 months, is go to the fuel station and pop some fresh fuel in, because we all know that today shelf life of fuel is very, very short indeed, and you can do a lot of damage to the engine. You can burn exhaust valves very quickly by boosting on stale fuel.
Hostia, lo había escuchado muchas veces, pero no pensaba que fuera tan importante. Dice que nunca llenes el depósito, que eches un poco de gasolina, porque la gasolina rancia vieja hace muchos años, especialmente la de escape, que lo quema. Interesante, ¿eh?
So this is a cold start of the F40. We turn the ignition on and we hear no fuel pumps. Now, my recommendation is to give the car no pumps initially. We'll just press the button once, but for a very short period of time for good reason. And now we hear the fuel pumps kicking in. We let them prime the engine. Make sure
Hostia, qué interesante. Tienes que cebar las bombas primero.
it's in neutral, and then we'll give it a go. So we just hold the button until it fires. Now, I haven't used any throttle yet, and we hear it failed, and the fuel pumps went again. So now
Y que arranque. Eso que tiene inyección mecánica, pero cómo cuesta arrancar, ¿no?
I'll give it another push. Now, because that's happened about 3 times, next time I am going to use the slightest amount of throttle. No big pumps whatsoever. The fuel pumps should have primed the engine as much as you need it to. There we go. Now, much like any engine, it's important to warm it up to temperature before you go. But another piece of advice I'd offer is please don't leave your engine idling for a very long period of time. It's very easy to coke the engine up, wet the plugs. You know, you want to get the engine to a temperature that's relatively warm, so just off the 0 on the water temperature. And then maybe you give it a few small revs and get going in the car and gently bring the car up to temperature without using big revs until you see 80 or 90 degrees on the water temperature. So
Joder, claro, es que estas inyecciones antiguas que moja la bujía, ¿sabes? Si no tienes mucho rato ahí en ralentí.
in terms of the interior, that is pretty much it. Very simple. To open this door again, we just pull the cable, pops it open, and we push it open, and we'll get out. So to close the doors, it sounds crazy, it's not the easiest thing in the world. Because they're so light, they don't have that momentum when you're closing them. Now the door latch is around about here on the car. So the best thing to do is place your hand here and give it a
Muy interesante lo que dice, ¿eh?
good firm close like that. And now it's closed. So we hope you've enjoyed our user's guide. It's a little bit basic, but we
Espero que hayáis disfrutado de esta guía, que es un poco básica. Pues macho, si es completa, no sé qué nos cuentas. Están aquí 2 días. Mari, con lo que has invertido en tu clásico en comparación a precios actuales, ¿verías el proyecto viable en caso de empezarlo en estos tiempos? Bueno, no cambia mucho tampoco la diferencia de precio. Tampoco fue hace tantos años que empecé, ¿eh? Hará 5 años que empecé. Que me tengo que poner con él, porque me da pereza, tío. Quiero hacer el simulador antes, ¿sabes? Igual tendría que hacer el coche antes que el simulador.
think it takes you through most of the steps. If you have